At 9:12 in the morning, hundreds of people were standing at the edge of the water in Texas City, Texas, watching a ship burn. The smoke coming off the SS Grandcamp had turned a strange orange-yellow, beautiful in a way, curling up into a clear April sky. Children had been let out to look. Office workers leaned on the fence. Nobody ran, because nothing about it felt dangerous yet. It was just a fire on a boat, and the fireboat would be along any minute. And then the ship, and the dock, and a good part of the town were simply gone. The blast was so violent, it was felt 150 miles away, registered as an earthquake hundreds of miles inland, and knocked airplanes out of the sky. In a single second, almost everyone standing at that fence ceased to exist. How does a cargo of fertilizer, the same stuff a farmer spreads on a field, kill nearly 600 people and erase an American town off the map in the time it takes to blink? This is the story of the deadliest industrial accident in the history of the United States. It happened on April 16, 1947, in a working port on the Texas Gulf Coast, and most Americans today have never heard of it. The numbers alone are hard to hold in your head. At least 581 people dead, more than 3,000 injured, an entire volunteer fire department wiped out to the last man but one, and the cause was not a bomb, not sabotage, not an act of war. It was a common agricultural chemical that the United States government itself had ordered manufactured and shipped overseas to feed a hungry, war-torn world. To understand how a good intention turned into a crater, you have to understand the town, the ship, the cargo, and a single decision made by a ship's captain who only wanted to protect his load. By the time you reach the end, you will see why this disaster rewrote how America thinks about chemical safety, and why a grieving town spent the next decade fighting its own government in court, only to lose. Texas City, in 1947, was a young, hard-working place. It sat on the western shore of Galveston Bay, a deep-water port carved out of the marsh, with a population of around 16,000. The war had been over for less than 2 years, and the town was booming. Oil refineries, chemical plants, tin smelters, and a busy dock all crowded together along the waterfront, close enough that a man could walk from his job at the Monsanto plant to the slip where the freighters tied up in a couple of minutes. That closeness was the whole point of the place. It was efficient. The chemicals came in, the products went out, and the paychecks were steady. Nobody thought much about the fact that the homes, the schools, the businesses, and some of the most volatile materials on Earth were all packed into the same square mile. A historian who later studied the disaster put it plainly. The people of Texas City felt safe because nothing like this had ever happened, so they assumed it never could. There was one man who did not feel safe. A local Catholic priest named William Roach had said, months before, that he felt like he was sitting on a keg of dynamite. It was the kind of thing a person says without really meaning it, a figure of speech. When the smoke rose over the docks that April morning, Father Roach drove down to the waterfront to see if he could help. He was among the dead. The ship at the center of it all was the SS Grandcamp. She was a Liberty ship, one of the thousands of cargo vessels the United States had mass-produced during the Second World War to keep the supply lines open. Built in 1942, she had originally carried an American name, the Benjamin R. Curtis. After the war, she was handed over to France as part of the effort to help Europe rebuild, and she now sailed under the French flag with a French crew, captained by a man named Charles de Guilbon. She was 437 feet of welded steel, and on the morning of the disaster, she was tied up at the north slip of the Texas City dock, taking on cargo for the trip across the Atlantic. What she was carrying is the heart of this story. In her holds sat roughly 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate. To most people, those words mean nothing. Ammonium nitrate is a nitrogen compound, and in its ordinary life, it is one of the most useful substances on the planet. Spread on farmland, it is fertilizer, the thing that makes corn grow tall and wheat come in thick. After the war, the world was starving. Europe and Asia had been torn apart, harvests had failed, and millions of people in territories under American and Allied occupation were going hungry. So the United States government set up a program to manufacture enormous quantities of fertilizer-grade ammonium nitrate and ship it overseas to grow food and head off famine. The cargo in the Grandcamp was part of that program. On paper, it was an act of mercy, a peacetime mission to feed the defeated. But ammonium nitrate has a second nature, and it is a dark one. The very chemistry that makes it good fertilizer, its hunger to release nitrogen, also makes it a powerful oxidizer. Under the right conditions, with enough heat and enough confinement, it does not just burn, it detonates. This was not a secret in 1947. Ammonium nitrate had been used in explosives and in mining for decades, but the version loaded onto these ships, called Bygone, for fertilizer-grade ammonium nitrate, was widely treated as safe to handle. It came as small beige pellets, coated with clay and a wax made from petroleum so it would not absorb moisture and clump together in the humid Gulf air. It was packed into ordinary paper sacks, 100 pounds each, and stacked in the holds by longshoremen who handled it like any other bulk cargo. The men loading it had been warned about almost nothing. Some of them, by some accounts, were smoking on the job. That coating of wax and petroleum, the very thing added to keep the fertilizer dry and pourable, may have been part of what turned a chemical into a weapon. It gave the ammonium nitrate fuel. And the paper sacks, stacked tight in a steel hold with the hatches closed, gave it confinement. Every condition for a catastrophe was quietly being assembled, sack by sack, in the belly of a ship, while the town went about its mourning. The Grandcamp had arrived at Texas City a few days earlier, on April 11th, and the loading of her holds had begun on the 14th. She was not going anywhere under her own power that week. Her engine was torn down for repairs, which meant that when trouble came, she could not simply cast off and steam out into open water away from the town. She was a fixed point, tied to the dock, with the port and the plants and the people pressed in close around her. The fire was discovered early, sometime around 8 in the morning on April 16th. Down in hold number 4, deep among the stacked paper sacks, a longshoreman noticed smoke working its way up through the cargo. At first it was a small thing, a wisp, the kind of nuisance that turns up on a busy dock and gets dealt with in a few minutes. Nobody knows for certain how it started. The leading theory, never proven, is that a cigarette tossed carelessly the day before had been smoldering down in the sacks all night, working slowly through the paper and the wax until it found enough heat to spread. By the time anyone saw it, the fire may already have been burning, unseen, for hours. Whatever the source, the men tried at first to put it out themselves, with the few extinguishers and the jugs of drinking water they had at hand. They threw what they had at it, and it did no good. The smoke kept coming, and it was changing color, taking on that eerie orange tint that meant the chemistry below was already breaking down and venting toxic gas into the hold. Within the hour, the longshoremen were ordered up out of the ship and off the dock, and a call went out for the town's firefighters. Here the story turns on a decision that seemed reasonable at the time and proved fatal. The captain faced a choice. He could flood the hold with seawater and drown the fire, but seawater would ruin thousands of dollars of cargo, soaking the fertilizer into useless sludge. Or he could try to smother the fire without destroying the load. He chose the cargo. He ordered the hatches battened down and live steam piped into the hold, the idea being to choke the fire of oxygen and snuff it out. It was standard practice for an ordinary cargo fire. It was exactly the wrong thing to do here. Steam did not smother the ammonium nitrate. It is an oxidizer, which means it carries its own oxygen inside it. Sealing the hold only trapped the heat, and the steam itself helped drive the chemical breakdown, feeding the very reaction the captain was trying to stop. Down in the dark, the temperature was climbing past any point of return. The pressure built against the closed steel hatches until the covers blew off and flames shot into the sky. By now, it was a spectacle. The fire department had arrived, the town's volunteers, and they laid their hoses along the dock and went to work. Word had spread, and people came down to the waterfront to watch. Estimates put the crowd at several hundred. School was nearby. Workers at the Monsanto plant, a stone's throw across the slip, came to the windows and out onto the grounds to see what the commotion was. The colored smoke, the burning ship, the firemen scrambling. It had the look of a show, not a threat. People who had lived their whole lives next to these chemicals had no reason to believe a fertilizer ship could do them any harm. They stood, and they pointed, and they waited to see how it would end. At 9:12 in the morning, it ended. The Grandcamp detonated all at once, roughly 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate going off in a single instant. It was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions human beings have ever produced. The ship did not break apart so much as vanish, converted into a cloud of fire and a storm of flying steel. The blast leveled everything within 2,000 feet. The Monsanto plant, right across the water, took the full force of it and collapsed into rubble and flame. A wall of water, a small tsunami around 15 feet high, was shoved out of the slip and swept across the docks, carrying a loaded barge inland and dragging bodies and debris back out. The shock wave raced outward and shattered windows in Galveston, miles across the bay, and rattled buildings as far as Houston, 40 miles away. Far inland, seismographs twitched and recorded the shock as a small earthquake. The Grandcamp's anchor, a 2-ton piece of forged iron, was thrown more than 1.5 miles and buried itself 10 feet deep in the earth, leaving a crater where it landed. Another anchor, weighing several tons, was flung 0.5 mile in the other direction. Thousands of tons of the ship's steel were turned into shrapnel and hurled across the town at the speed of bullets, scything through people, cars, and walls. Overhead, 2 small airplanes carrying sightseers who had come up to look at the fire were knocked clean out of the sky by the blast. On the ground, more than 1,000 vehicles were wrecked. Hundreds of railroad freight cars were crushed and scattered. Tanks of oil and chemicals all along the waterfront caught fire, and the smoke from those fires would burn for days. The volunteer fire department of Texas City had 28 men on its roster. 27 of them were standing at the dock with their hoses when the ship went up, and 27 of them died in that 1 second. An entire fire department gone, the men who would have led the rescue now among the dead who needed rescuing. The single survivor was a firefighter named Fred Dowdy, who had not gone down to answer the call. In the days that followed, it fell to him to organize the firefighters who poured in from towns up to 60 miles away to fight what was left. The town had lost the very people trained to save it in the very first instant of the catastrophe. Inside the Monsanto plant, the toll was staggering. Of the 574 employees and contractors on site that morning, 234 were killed, and around 200 more were injured. Some were at their stations. Some had walked over to watch the fire, never imagining it could reach them across the water. The plant's own firefighting team had been laying out hose directly opposite the Grandcamp. They were among the first to die. What followed the blast was not a scene anyone present would ever be able to describe fully. The waterfront was on fire from end to end. A black mushroom of smoke climbed 2,000 feet over the town and hung there, visible for miles in every direction, so that people up and down the coast knew before any word reached them that something terrible had happened at Texas City. Wreckage and bodies lay across an area that had been a functioning industrial port minutes before. People wandered out of collapsed buildings, deaf, bleeding, their clothing torn away by the pressure wave, looking for husbands and children and co-workers who were no longer findable. Some of the injured were children who had been let out of nearby schools or who had simply walked down to see the fire and who now lay among the glass and the rubble. The injured streamed away from the docks any way they could, on foot, in the backs of trucks, carried by strangers. Across the bay in Galveston, in Houston, in towns up and down the coast, doctors and nurses heard what had happened and began driving toward Texas City, against the flow of people fleeing the other way. The hospitals, several of them damaged by the same blast, filled past capacity within the hour. The auditorium of the city hall and a school gymnasium were turned into emergency morgues, where rows of the dead were laid out under sheets for families to walk among. Searching faces, the Red Cross, the Army, the Texas National Guard, and ordinary citizens by the thousands converged on the ruined town to dig and to carry and to count. For days afterward, oil fires along the waterfront sent up columns of greasy black smoke that could be seen from Houston, a marker on the horizon of where the town had been. And while they worked, a second ship was quietly turning into a second bomb. Tied up about 600 feet from where the Grandcamp had been was another freighter, the SS High Flyer. She too was carrying ammonium nitrate, around 960 tons of it, and on top of that she held some 2,000 tons of sulfur. The first explosion had damaged her, knocked her loose, and set fires smoldering in her holds. In the chaos of the day, with hundreds dead and the whole waterfront aflame, the danger she posed was not fully grasped until late. Tugboat crews tried for hours to pull her away from the dock and out into open water, but she was fouled against the wreck of yet another ship, the Wilson B. Keene, and could not be moved. As the night wore on, smoke poured from the High Flyer, and the men working near her could smell the same sharp tang that had risen from the Grandcamp that morning. Around midnight, the order finally went out to clear the area. The crews backed away from the burning ship and waited. At 10 minutes past 1 in the morning on April 17th, the High Flyer exploded. By the accounts of those who saw both, this blast was even more powerful than the first. It tore the Wilson B. Keene apart, blew out the fires that rescuers had nearly brought under control, and rained burning sulfur and steel back down on the wrecked port. One of the High Flyer's massive propellers was blown nearly a mile inland, but this time the area had been evacuated. Where the first explosion had killed hundreds, the second killed only 2 more people. It was a brutal lesson learned at the cost of the first 600 lives. The thing that had been impossible to imagine at 9 in the morning was, by 1 the next morning, finally being treated as the deadly threat it was. When the fires burned down and the counting was done, the scale of the loss settled over the town like ash. At least 581 people were dead. Some estimates run higher, and the true number can never be known with certainty, because some victims were never found at all. More than 3,000 were injured, and by some counts the figure of those needing treatment ran well past that. Hundreds of children were left orphaned. Hundreds of homes were destroyed, and thousands of people had no place to sleep. Nearly 1,000 buildings were leveled or ruined. The financial loss ran into the tens, by some accounts hundreds, of millions of 1947 dollars. The dead presented a problem that haunts the story to this day. The explosion had been so violent that many of the victims were torn apart beyond any hope of recognition. Identifying the dead took months. In the end, dozens of bodies, 63 by the common count, could never be identified at all. They were buried together in a memorial cemetery, marked but nameless, men and women, and perhaps children, whose families would never know for certain what had become of them. Beyond those 63, more than 100 people were listed as missing, presumed killed, with no remains ever recovered to bury. They had been standing too close when the ship went up, and the blast had left nothing behind. Once the immediate horror passed, the questions began. How could this have happened? Who was responsible? And could it happen again? Investigators descended on the wreckage. The fundamental finding was sobering in its simplicity. Almost no one involved had understood that the cargo in those ships was a bomb waiting for a spark. The longshoremen had not been warned. The ship's officers had treated it as routine freight. The decision to seal the hold and pump in steam, the choice that turned a manageable fire into a detonation, had been made by men following the ordinary playbook for an ordinary cargo fire, with no idea that this cargo would answer steam with annihilation. The exact origin of the fire itself was never determined. The cigarette theory remained just that, a theory, plausible but never proven. What the disaster exposed was a vast, dangerous gap between what the government and industry knew about ammonium nitrate and what the people handling it on the ground had been told. The fertilizer had been manufactured to federal specifications, in plants operating under government direction, coated and bagged and shipped according to procedures that had never seriously reckoned with the possibility that thousands of tons of the stuff, packed into a steel hold and exposed to fire, could go off like a munitions dump. The material had been classified and handled as a fertilizer, a farm product, when its behavior under heat and confinement was that of a high explosive. The catastrophe at Texas City was, at bottom, a failure to take a known danger seriously because it wore an innocent name. The reforms that followed reshaped American industry. The way ammonium nitrate was manufactured, stored, labeled, and transported was overhauled. Rules were rewritten so that the material would be treated with the caution its chemistry demanded, with attention to how it was bagged, how hot it was when packed, how it was stowed aboard ship, and how the people handling it were warned. The disaster became a permanent fixture in the study of industrial safety and emergency response, taught to firefighters and chemical engineers as the case that showed what happens when a community lives cheek by jowl with materials it does not respect. The hard knowledge bought in Texas City that April would, over the decades, save lives in ports and plants and farm towns all over the country. It also fed directly into a new field, the serious study of how cities should plan for industrial disaster, how mutual aid between towns should work, and how the chaos that engulfed Texas City could be met with something more organized the next time. But there was another fight still to come, and it was fought not in a chemistry lab or a firehouse, but in a courtroom. The people of Texas City, the survivors and the widows and the orphans, looked at the smoking ruin of their town and asked a reasonable question. The cargo that killed their families had been made to the government's own design, under the government's own program, shipped under the government's own watch. Was the government not responsible? In 1946, just the year before, Congress had passed the Federal Tort Claims Act, a law that for the first time allowed ordinary citizens to sue the United States government for harm caused by the negligence of its employees. For most of American history, an old principle called sovereign immunity had made that nearly impossible. The idea, inherited from English law, was that the government could not be sued without its own consent. The Tort Claims Act was Congress consenting, opening the door at last for citizens to hold their government to account the way they could hold a careless company or a reckless driver. The families of Texas City walked through that door. They filed suit, thousands of them, in what became one of the first great mass legal actions against the federal government. The lead plaintiff was a woman named Elizabeth Dalehite, suing over the death of her husband. The case carried the names of more than 8,000 claimants behind it. At first, they won. In 1950, a federal district court ruled that the United States government had indeed been negligent in the way it ran the whole fertilizer program, in how it manufactured and coated and bagged and labeled the ammonium nitrate, in its failure to warn the people handling it of its dangerous nature, and in its failure to oversee the loading of the ships. The court laid the responsibility squarely on the government. For the families, it was a vindication. The institution that had set this catastrophe in motion would be made to answer for it. It did not hold. The government appeal went up to the higher courts, and in 1953, the case reached the Supreme Court of the United States, under the name Dalehite versus United States. There, by a narrow vote of 4-3, the families lost. The court did not rule that the government had behaved well. It ruled, instead, that the kinds of decisions at issue, the choice to run the fertilizer program, the broad judgments about how to manufacture and ship the material, were what the law called discretionary functions. The Tort Claims Act, the majority held, had waived the government's immunity for the everyday negligence of its workers, the careless act of an individual employee, but not for the high-level policy choices of the government as a whole. Deciding to feed a starving world with American fertilizer, and the many judgments that flowed from that decision, fell into a protected category the law did not reach. The doors that had seemed to open in 1946 swung partway shut. The families had proven negligence and still walked away with nothing, blocked by the very principle of sovereign immunity they thought the new law had set aside. 3 justices dissented, and their objection cut to the bone. If the government could cause a disaster of this magnitude through its own negligence and then hide behind the word discretionary, then the promise of the Tort Claims Act was hollow for the people who needed it most. But the dissent did not carry the day, and the legal door it described stayed mostly closed. To this day, the discretionary function exception remains one of the most important and most argued over limits on the ability of Americans to sue their own government. The story did not quite end there. The families had lost in court, but the sheer human weight of what had happened at Texas City would not let Congress look away. In 1955, lawmakers did what the courts would not. They passed a special law to compensate the victims, setting up a process to pay the survivors and the families of the dead out of the public treasury, not because a court had ordered it, but as an act of national conscience. In the end, nearly 1,400 awards were made, totaling close to $17 million. It was not justice in the legal sense the families had sought. No court had held the government liable, but it was an acknowledgement, paid in money, that the nation owed something to the town it had asked to store its dangerous cargo. So what is left of Texas City more than 75 years on? The town was rebuilt. The refineries and the chemical plants came back, the docks were repaired, and the people who survived raised the next generation in the same square mile by the bay. The memory, though, is woven into the place. There is a memorial cemetery where the 63 unidentified dead lie together. There is a propeller from the High Flyer, blown a mile through the air on the second night, now set up as a monument. Every April, the town gathers to read the names and to remember the morning the sky came down. The lesson of Texas City is not a complicated one, but it is one that every generation seems to have to learn again. The danger had a friendly face. It was fertilizer, the stuff of farms and gardens, packed in paper sacks and labeled like any other freight. It killed nearly 600 people because nobody believed it could. The smoke that morning drew a crowd instead of scattering one, and the men in charge fought it the way they would have fought any fire, because no one had told them this fire was different. We surround ourselves with power, with chemicals and fuels and forces that make modern life possible, and we grow comfortable living next to them precisely because they so rarely turn on us. Texas City is the reminder of what it costs when familiarity becomes complacency, when a thing that has never blown up is assumed to be a thing that never will. The next time you drive past a port stacked with containers, or a plant with tanks and towers along a highway, or even a bag of fertilizer in a garden shed, you might remember a clear April morning in 1947 when hundreds of ordinary people stood at a fence to watch a beautiful orange fire, certain they were safe, in the last minutes of their lives. If you want more forgotten stories like this one, the true ones that history left out of the textbooks, you know what to do.